and the lead for the new Indiana Resilience Funding Hub. This is the third webinar presented by the Indiana Resilience Funding Hub, which is a collaboration between the Environmental Resilience Institute and the Center for Rural Engagement, represented here by Jacob Simpson, who will act as our Q&A moderator. You can post your questions in the chat. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll be able to find it and all other webinars on our website, which will be noticed later in this presentation. Our special guest today is Brett Roberts, the Indiana State Revolving Fund Program Manager. In this role, he empowers communities throughout the SRF process with the end goal of protecting human health and environment throughout Indiana. He holds a master's degree of public affairs with a concentration in community and economic and environmental economic development from Indiana University's O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. Following graduate school, Brett spent time in South Bend, Indiana as a community development planner, helping communities across northern Indiana through state and federal grant processes and their comprehensive planning efforts. When Brett isn't in the office, he can be found reading, biking, or exploring America's third coast, the Great Lakes. For the agenda, before we'll let Brett get over. We've just done the welcome and introduction. We'll review the infrastructure, otherwise known as the IIJA Act, and examples of state pass-through funding. This is also known as the Bilateral Infrastructure Law, or BIL, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, excuse me. We'll do an overview of the Indiana Finance Authority funds and opportunities, positioning your community for IFA funding, how the Indiana Resilience Funding Hub can assist you in building climate resilience, and then we'll follow that up with question and answer. And so at this point, we'll let Brett take it away.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. I always forget that I put the thing about the Great Lakes at the end of my bios, and I've never heard it read like that, so that might be coming out next time. But I do love Lake Michigan. I spent a lot of time up there when I worked in South Bend. But why we're here today is to talk about the Indiana Finance Authority's State Revolving Fund. And so for many of you, I see some familiar faces as I scroll through and some new faces, which is great as well. For those of you who don't know, this Indiana Finance Authority is a state agency that encompasses the State Revolving Fund. And the State Revolving Funds were set up at two different times. The first one was the Clean Water Revolving Fund, which was set up in the early 80s, and the Drinking Water one was set up in 1996. So as you can see on the screen here, what do we do in the revolving fund? Well, when Congress passed the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, they didn't have any money to go with it. So there were a lot of utilities that were sitting there realizing that they had to comply with these regulations, and there was no money to go with it. So they set up the state revolving funds. And so our job is to ensure communities meet the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act on both sides of their utility. We can also work with some other nonprofits and some other water corporations. We'll get into those details later if need be, but generally we use the word communities to encompass all of our borrowers at the State Revolving Fund. So where does our money come from? Our money is federal funds that come from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that are administered by us at the state. So every state receives a portion of funds from the EPA to administer these programs in their individual states. Indiana is a little bit different than some other states in that we not only administer these funds, we also leverage these funds, which basically is a fancy way of saying we go out into the market with those funds and we borrow money ourselves with the state of Indiana, by the state of Indiana, in order to maximize the amount of money we can offer to communities. So the key takeaway on that line is just that we administer federal funds in the state of Indiana. How do those funds come to communities? Well, first off, you can see I've put the fun part a little bit smaller than the rest, but we offer long-term low-interest loans. So right now, when you hear loans, most people are turned off. They're like, I don't want to borrow money. I just want the money. Well, the nature of a revolving fund is that as we loan money out to communities, it's typically a 20 or 35-year loan at a super low interest rate, especially right now. So that's going to be somewhere in the range of between 2 and 3% interest rate. That means that that money, as it comes back to us, can then go out to help other communities. So when we started in 1996 with this, the drinking water SRF, we just had that initial allotment. But as people have begun to pay back their loans to us, we're able to offer that money back out again. So it's actually a great way to fund infrastructure, those loans. And you'll see here right below that, I said in small print, sometimes forgivable loans, because I want to be honest that we do offer forgivable loans at certain times and for certain communities. And we can talk about that in a little bit, we will. But our bread and butter program are the long-term low interest loans. These are a way for communities to have a stake in what they're doing, as well as for us to maximize those dollars further down. And then, as I've mentioned before, our funds are available for drinking water and clean water projects. We'll get into the specifics of what actually, what those entail. But generally speaking, any water infrastructure projects, the state revolving fund deals with. So with that, we'll go to our next slide here, Cody. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or we've shortened it to BILL. So whenever you hear BILL, think Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So first off, one of the first slides and what you've probably heard about most is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA. That is the exact same thing as BILL. However, EPA, for whatever reason, decided they were going to call it BILL instead of IIJA, just to confuse us. So whenever the State Revolving Fund talks about BILL, we're talking about the IIJA and the money that was made available through that legislation. That legislation took effect on November 15th, 2021. Just a fun fact, I started a week before it went into effect, so I had no idea what I was getting myself into. But it's the single largest investment in water infrastructure ever, full stop. Before BILL came about, the state of Indiana would see about $54 million per year funneled into the state of Indiana. That would be about $16 million on the drinking water side and about $38 million on the clean water side. With BILL, we would expect $126 million on top of that $54 million per year through through federal fiscal year 2027. So we are just seeing, this is we use the term a lot these days, unprecedented, but this is a truly unprecedented investment in water infrastructure. And it really is going to change how Indiana deals with water and what we can, what kind of projects we can actually implement. And so we'll get into the details on this next slide, Cody, if you'll go to that one. So I titled this New Funding and Old Commitments because the old commitments is that top line, that annual investment. Drinking water, Indiana will get $16 million. Clean water will get $38 million. That money is basically the same every single year. It's been about that same amount since around 2008. Those numbers get adjusted by a calculation that EPA does. But generally you expect that to be about the ratio. However, our new funding, this new investment, is broken down by category. And I just want to go through each category because we're going to go dive into these later. So through fiscal year 27, drinking water, general projects will receive $27 million more. Lead service line replacement on the drinking water side will receive about $43 million more. And we just got word that we might be getting even more money there. Emerging contaminants, which we'll dive into, is getting about $11 million per year. On the clean water side, we're looking at $43 million in addition to the 38 that we get every year, as well as there's a tiny bit of money for the emerging contaminant side of things, about $2 million on the clean water side. So again, what does all of this mean? I'm really showing you this to show that we went from a pretty, a large program, but not, we couldn't do a lot of innovative things, to now we have 5 additional pots of money and large pots of money that we can draw from and help communities throughout the state of Indiana improve their water quality and improve their drinking water quality. So we'll dive into these pots of money in the next slide here. All right, so first is the drinking water supplemental funding. So that's that $27 million of additional funding. These projects are pretty general drinking water projects, right? So anything that deals with the source of water, new wells, well rehabilitation, wellhead protection areas, any type of funding to deal with the actual source of the water. This does include things like switching wells if your well field is contaminated, anything of that sort. One note I should make here is that the SRFs do not fund economic development projects, full stop. So if you are looking to increase your capacity because you have a large factory coming, or you're looking to increase your capacity because of a variety of aspects related to economic development, we aren't in the process. We're not in the business of speculation. We're really focused on what is the community doing now and what are their needs today. The next step is treatment systems. So, we built a lot of water treatment plants in the 90s, and those are starting to, become less relevant and need some updates. So any type of treatment system updates, that can be anything from adding some filters to your water treatment system, all the way to you need an entirely new water treatment plant. We also have seen a lot of folks recently adding some filters for PFAS, which cost quite a bit of money, as well as for some other emerging contaminants, and I'll list those later on as well. Next up, the storage tank. So any type of storage we can deal with, especially when it has to do with pressure in the system. So if your system needs more pressure or you just need more capacity, we're able to fund storage tanks. And then finally, the most common are those distribution systems. So water main breaks, any sort of new water mains, replacing old water mains, anything in the distribution system, we are able to fund. This does include lead service line replacement. We're also getting to the point where, let's say your community needs to replace so many water mains. We are now asking those communities to identify on those water mains, what is the service line material? I'm sure you all know that the lead service line inventories are coming down the pike. We'll need those in 2024. And we're asking you to do a little bit of that work in tandem with these projects. If you come across lead in those projects, we ask that you now replace those along with the water main. This is a way for us not to duplicate work in the future. It also isn't great to shake around those service lines with the water main that are lead and all sorts of public health issues there. So we'll get to septic tanks at the very end here. I see a note there, but this is just the drinking water supplemental funding. So this is the things that we've always been doing. This is our bread and butter, like I said earlier. These are things we're used to. Now, the next slide is one that is brand new to us. So this is lead line replacement funding. I shortened that title a little bit to make it all fit, but this is $43 million that is coming into the state of Indiana every year through fiscal year 27. And this flat out is reduce human exposure to lead and water. As many of you know, it looks like in the coming years, EPA will be issuing a rule to replace all lead service lines. We're currently in the process of lead service line inventories across the state of Indiana. Pretty basically, this pot of money is to replace lead service lines. This is the only picture I have on my slides, unfortunately, but I wanted to share it because our rules have changed a bit. So if you dealt with SRF in the early 2000s and you wanted to replace lead service lines, the rule was you could only go to the water meter or to the property boundary. You could not go onto private property. Well, we now know, unfortunately, that when you have a partial lead service line, that increases the chance of lead exposure to those in the home. Just the work that goes into it, any type of partial replacement is now no longer eligible. We cannot fund partial replacements of lead service lines. Even if someone came and asked me, in my opinion, I would say do not do partial lead service lines, even if we're not funding you. However, the new rule is that we are able to fund all the way to the home's premise plumbing, which is usually defined as a shutoff valve inside the home. That is brand new. That means we can go onto private property, we can replace the entire lead service line all the way up to that cutoff valve. or that shutoff valve, I should say, to make sure we get as much lead out as possible. That is a challenge. We've seen some challenge. We just know that some people aren't really susceptible to utilities coming into their homes for whatever reason, and those are totally valid. But there's lots of opportunities here to replace as much lead as we can in the state of Indiana. If you ever have a chance, the EPA put out some good information, I think last month or 2 months ago now, about the probability of lead per state. And Indiana is one of those states that has a ton of lead. If you look at just our housing stock age, when we were building buildings, how we developed, this state is one of the larger lead contaminated states. So getting this lead out is a huge priority on our part at the SRF. So if we have more questions about the details of that, we can get into that later, but I want to move on to the next drinking water pot of money, which is the emerging contaminant pot of money. So this is just for drinking water emerging contaminants. It's $11 million. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is very helpful in this pursuit. So EPA has been really direct in their guidance that this money is explicitly for PFAS and PFOA, which is a class of chemicals that has emerged in the last 50 years and has contaminated quite a bit of drinking water, quite a bit of you can find it in a lot of scary places now, but most concerningly in drinking water. And so when communities come to us with PFAS contaminated water, we direct this funding to those communities. However, Indiana is a little bit luckier in this space than we are in lead, in that there isn't a whole lot of PFAS, PFOA contamination in drinking water. That does not mean there's not concerns, but there's not as much as there could have been. So if communities are dealing with other emerging contaminants, which EPA has defined as any contaminant on the contaminant candidate list, which you can find on the EPA's website, those can also be funded through these funds. So for example, in Indiana, a really common emerging contaminant in our groundwater is manganese. And we can typically get rid of manganese in the same way we get rid of iron using specific filters. So that's all to say that PFAS and PFOA is our main concern with this grouping of funding. However, there are other types of emerging contaminants we can help you get rid of. We can also do some investigative work on this. So if there's water, if you need to do some water testing to understand what's in your drinking water, we can think about that as well. IDEM also is doing PFAS testing, so we're helping get that into our pipeline as well. So again, we can get into more questions about this pot of money, but we'll move to the next big pot, which is clean water. And I'm gonna look at my time here. This next one is the clean water supplemental funding. So this is very similar to that initial drinking water funding I mentioned, except for it's all for clean water projects. So these are things we already do and have been doing for almost 30 years with the clean water supplemental funding. It's an additional $42 million on top of that $38 million, and it goes towards the list of items you see here. So septic elimination projects, I know someone mentioned that. So let's say you have septic, failing septic systems or even non-failing septic systems in your service area or in or near your service area. Those are all eligible to be funded through our program. Any collection system improvements are eligible. CSO correction is very common. So Indianapolis's Big Dig, if you remember, where they are digging big tunnels underneath Indianapolis to put their overflow during big rain events. That is all funded through SRF. We have multiple CSO projects in Richmond, in Peru, Fort Wayne, might not be Fort Wayne, but anyway, a variety of places, and any CSO correction is eligible through our funds. Any treatment improvements are eligible through our funds. This goes towards, some more advanced treatment for pharmaceuticals and waste. I'm not as familiar with the clean water side of things yet. I only took over this program about 2 months ago or 3 months ago, so I'm still learning. But if you have any questions, my contact information will be on the last slide here, and we'll go through that. And you can email me there. The stormwater improvements are also eligible. I'll tell you, we don't fund as many stormwater improvement projects but we do fund some. So if you're looking to do anything with your stormwater systems, those are also eligible through our program. And we'll go to the last new pot of money here. And just to say, emerging contaminants on the clean water side. This is only $2 million, which in our world is not a lot. However, we're kind of using it for the items listed here. So addressing PFAS discharges in clean water systems, investigating PFAS contamination in clean water systems, and also researching contaminant plumes that lead to a project. So for example, if a community is seeing a really high level of PFAS in their wastewater and they don't know where it's coming from, we can help fund the investigation to determine where that's coming from. I'll say this pot of money has been very elusive to us, even in the SRF. We're still working to figure out how we need and want to spend this. But I look at this pot of money as kind of the one world, one water approach, right? We're obviously trying to eliminate PFAS at the drinking water. We also need to eliminate it before it goes back into our rivers and streams. So I'll leave that there. Next slide here. And before I do that, how are we doing on time, Cody? Do I need to?
You're good.
Okay, perfect. So along with the 5 pots of money I just ran through, and again, I can take more questions about those because I know it went pretty quick. The EPA and the Biden administration have been very explicit that 49% in most cases of this money needs to go towards disadvantaged communities. And each state is given the ability to determine, what is disadvantaged, which a lot of communities think, I don't want to be called disadvantaged. Why do I need to, meet that criteria? This is a way for us to really dig into communities that have often been overlooked by federal spending or have been or will be neglected in the future to determine how we can best help them. So I'll just get into how Indiana determines disadvantaged communities. And there's always questions on this, so feel free to ask these at the end as well. So first off, our top line disadvantaged community definition is based on median household income. So each community based on the census tract has a median household income. And if that median household income is below 80% of the state's MHI, they qualify as disadvantaged. I'm going to say that again because it's a lot. So 80% of Indiana's MHI is about $49,555. That's kind of 80% of our state's MHI. Any community with an MHI below that number qualifies as a disadvantaged community in our eyes. So that's the first top line metric, if you will. However, we recognize that median household income does not encompass all the issues in communities and in populations that might make it disadvantaged. So we also added 5 additional metrics to look at when measuring a community's disadvantaged status. So the first one is population over 65. This typically, we added this one because one, we know that that set of population are typically on fixed incomes. So any type of rate increases or putting them on a new system with a rate or with a monthly bill is going to impact them more than it will those who are able to work. Secondly, we know that population is also the most susceptible to drinking water violations. So any nitrate violations tend to impact older communities more than those, in 18 to 55. So we know that population is susceptible in many ways. We also know that an aging population indicates that community might not be as vibrant as it used to be. And so understanding that metric helps us understand if that community is disadvantaged. Next up is the minority population. And this is one where people typically are like, whoa, what does that mean? How is that defined? Am I losing out on money because I'm in rural Indiana? And that's not true. So we do kind of 2 ways of looking at this. Any community that is large, and we've defined large in different ways, so I'm not going to define it here, but any larger communities that are 50% or more minority receive points and are considered disadvantaged communities. Rural communities have a different standard, which is about 20% of minority population. And we do, minority population is based both on race and ethnicity, all using census data. And this is just to recognize that our federal government hasn't been great about investing in these communities in the past. And the more we can invest in them now, especially around the lead service line piece, the better our outcomes will be for the future. Next up is population trend. And I guess I have two pictures on this PowerPoint. This is my second one here. So you can see on this map of Indiana, the projected population change by county from 2015 to 2050. And you'll notice, if you can see the key there, that dark orange color, those are communities that are going to lose population significantly within that time frame. The next light kind of yellow orange, those are also going to lose population in the next so many years. And so looking at this map, we realize that a large majority of our counties are going to continue to lose population over until 2050, yet they still have the water and wastewater utility systems that they had at their peak population in 1975, right? So they have this large utility footprint that they need to maintain. And so we want to capture that in some way. So any population trend, we also take into consideration in disadvantaged community metrics. The next one is the user rate impacts. So I love this example. I've done this example many times. So East Chicago, way up in Lake County, it's disadvantaged in a lot of these ways, but it's not disadvantaged in user rate impacts because they have a water intake valve on Lake Michigan and they sell that water to everybody else in Lake County. They're the main water producer. So they get to keep their rates really low. I literally think it's $7 a month for water in East Chicago. And so they're not considered disadvantaged when it comes to user rate impacts. However, we know that other communities are paying upwards of $75 for their water each month. And any loans that they would take on from us would increase that rate. And so we have a metric that we use to measure the impact of user rates. And that would also consider you for disadvantaged community funding. Finally, and I know this is a lot, I'm sorry, but finally is population below the poverty line. So this is a pretty general, another tool that the census information gives us. The Indiana's poverty line is about 12% of the population is below the poverty line. So any community that is above that percentage, we consider disadvantaged. Anyone below, we do not. So that 12% threshold is our threshold. So disadvantaged communities, I think, is the most exciting thing about this new funding. It is the federal government telling the states explicitly that we need to invest in communities that have long been overlooked. That encompasses both rural and urban communities, both communities of color and communities that look lily white. Both communities fall into this disadvantaged community category. And the state of Indiana explicitly is excited, I think, to invest in these communities and their projects to ensure that their infrastructure is viable moving forward. So we'll go to the next slide here to talk more about how you can access these funds. So you've heard me talk, you've heard all about all these funds, and this is the slide you wanted to hear this entire time, which is how do you access these funds? And so I was talking to Cody before, and I know a lot of the folks on here, have our cities, towns, our counties. And so those are our usual borrowers, right? These are the people that usually come to us. What you need to do to access our funds is first to start a conversation with me. I have my contact information on the next slide after this, but you'll want to contact me. And then the next step is to create a preliminary engineering report, or a PER as we call it. So this is usually you'll have an engineering firm on retainer there, and they'll help you think through the problems in your utility system and how you can address those. And from there, you would submit that PER and application to us. We work on the state fiscal year, which is July 1st through June 30th. Which essentially means you need to get your application to us by April 1st to be considered for funding by July 1st. So you're probably sitting here thinking, wow, it's June 1st. I've missed the boat for this year. That is true, but next year, April 1st always comes around sooner than people think. So if you start this process now, this conversation now about how what are the issues in our utility system and how can we address them? You should have a great PER by next April to submit to us with your application to be considered for funding in that next state fiscal year. So yeah, that's our initial, how do you enter our program? From there, SRF, we score and rank the projects based on the components of the project. So we have a pretty comprehensive scorecard that I can send to whoever would like it. It's been public commented. It essentially runs through a variety of things, but mainly, the question is this project addressing the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act? The second question is, how is this impacting the community, which is the disadvantaged community piece? And then lastly, some additional questions around climate resiliency, around things like green project reserve, which are components of the project that increase their value overall. Stuff like that. So we score and rank all the projects against each other. I should note here too, we rank drinking water and clean water apart. We don't judge those on the same case. We have a drinking water ranking system and a clean water ranking system. And then based on that ranking, we establish what we call a fundable range, which is essentially a range of funds that we know we have in that state fiscal year. So last year, the clean water side, or the drinking water side, excuse me, was about $100 million. That's how much we could fund. On the clean water side is about $300 million. Typically, those go up each year. My guess is it'll go up again this year. I haven't seen it ever go down, I don't think, in my research, but if you're in that range, and we'll set that range on July 1st each year. If you're in that range, your project can move forward in the very best terms with us, which essentially means that you will be offered a long-term, low-interest loan with us. You have the opportunity to discuss forgivable loans with us, especially around lead service lines and disadvantaged communities. And it's kind of the best situation if you're in the fundable range. You really get to drive the boat on where your project goes. If you're not in the range, which is the more common experience, more people are outside of the range than in the range, you have some other options. So the first option could be you go back to the drawing board and you rethink your project, or you rethink the problem perhaps, to score higher on our project priority list, we call it. So that's one option. Another option you have is that we can move forward with your project and we can close your loan with us in what we call a pooled financing, which essentially means there's no federal dollars associated with it. It's a straight up loan. There's no forgivable loans, but the state of Indiana, using our AAA bond rating, will go out to the market for you. We will take that bond. We will then loan you the money at a better interest rate than you can get probably on your own in the market, but not as good as that between 2% and 3% that we normally offer. And it's a way for us to be able to finance your project in a way that you might not be able to do on your own. Not many communities can go out and receive a $20 million loan at a low interest rate. That's just not how the market works. However, we like to use our influence on the market to get you a better interest rate. Again, that's no federal money at that point. It's a loan. There's not a lot of options for any interest rate reductions, but that's another option. So those are kind of the two options. If you're in the range, your project can move forward. If you're not in the range, you have some other options that we can talk about at that time. It also depends on, does the community absolutely need the project today? In that case, we would talk to you about pooled financing. I should also mention too, because I think I saw Pamela on here. We often work with the Office of Community and Rural Affairs on their programs, so we love to pair funding with them. We also pair our funding with the rural development dollars. So if any community is already working with rural development, we are happy to kind of be that gap financing for them. with Okra, we typically are the ones financing the rest of the project after the grant money is over. We're happy to work with other folks. We've been seeing some ready projects as of late that we're working on. Those are a little tricky because remember, we don't do economic development. We also do, and I'll say this again, but we also do economic development administration projects sometimes. Again, those are tricky because we don't do economic development, but we sometimes can make those work. So we like to pair funding to ensure the community gets what they need. Cody, if you want to go to the next slide, which is just my contact information. I'll just say this, we have a lot of money coming in over the next so many years. And we are trying to perfect our program and trying to make sure that every community has access to our process and to these funds. And we're hoping that we're making this as equitable as we can in the process. So if you have any questions for me in the future, you can't think of it today, feel free to send me an email. I did just get back from vacation, so my inbox is very full, but I will get back to you. We're excited to make our program work for communities. And even if, it's not, we talk and we end up finding that this isn't the program for you, we love to help you connect with other folks. So with that, I know I'm probably a little bit early, I talked pretty fast, but we can go into the next portion here.
I think, Brett, you're the star of the show. That was a fantastic presentation. I think we'll take questions now, and then we can come back to the content to finish up.
Great. Okay. Yes, thanks so much, Brett. We have had some questions come in. Some questions about the program in general, but then also some specific questions about maybe what eligible projects looks like depending on the type of funding available. So as a general question, how are these opportunities communicated to local water system managers? So things like rural water cooperatives, local government entities, county commissioners, et cetera. I know there's a lot of stakeholders in the water infrastructure world. So how is your agency engaging with these groups?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first I'll recognize what we've done in the past, which is not as much as we probably should have been doing. With limited funds, we always knew each year we had kind of a limited amount of projects that we could fund. So our outreach wasn't as wide sweeping, if you will, than it could have been. With these new funds, we recognize that we need to build some bridges and to get some more partners on the ground. So, for example, we've had a long-standing relationship with the Alliance of Rural Water. I always forget the full name, the Alliance. We also have a pretty good relationship with AIM, which is the Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, which is a good sounding board for us. We have kind of an outreach group, which is Sarah Hudson. I'm sure that name is familiar to some of you, who does the regional planning meetings, which is kind of a water resource planning group around the state. We also are at every trade show you can think of. So if you have an engineer, if a community or a utility has an engineer on staff, they probably know about us, and we've probably talked to them at a trade show. In Indiana, we're a bit unique in that we work a lot closer with the engineers initially than with the communities themselves. And so what that means is, you're always free to reach out to us directly before you have an engineer, but sometimes it's even better to start with your consulting engineer and say, okay, we've heard about this program. What do you know about it? How can we partner together to move forward? But I think, Jennifer, I think that was your question there. If you have any suggestions for us about how we can reach out and be better about our communication or our outreach, please let me know. I'm happy to take suggestions. Like I mentioned before, I think everyone was on. I've done a few of these presentations recently at the Indiana Rural Conference, Indiana Rural Conference and some other things. So always looking for ways to be better though.
Thanks, Brett. And I encourage everyone on the call, if you have a question for Brett, please put it in the chat and we'll make sure to get to it. If it's in the chat, we can have a record of it and make sure when we're done, we can get all the information out to folks on the call. But our next question, we now get into some of those specific funding light items you were talking about. So there's a question here about the lead service line replacement. Wondering if you can talk more about that shift in the rule between funding lead water line replacement up to the property line, now going, all the way to the home premises. The concern brought up is about, utilities needing to take on more debt to replace, something they're not responsible for. So if you could speak to kind of that, the trade-offs and challenges that you're navigating.
Yeah, this is a hard question, and it's a valid question. And I'm thinking about how to even start it. So there's many ways to address lead service lines, and every state has been different in this. There's a great example from Madison, Wisconsin, where they actually help subsidize lead service line replacements on the private side through a grant situation. Kind of like, I think I'm looking at the right question that Michael is addressing. Yeah, why would a utility take on more debt if they're going to end up giving this easement back to the property owner anyway? How Indiana is looking at this is the utility is the most capable and effective partner in that space to replace a lead service line. If you ask, so for example, right now we're looking at about $7,500 to replace one lead service line. If you walked up to a home and said, you should replace this lead service line for $7,500, I would look at you like you were crazy. We just realized that utilities are better equipped both financially and technically to replace these lines than anyone else. We also know that this is going to happen anyway. The EPA and the federal government are going to say that we have to replace lead service lines. So if we can get on top of it now and replace those through the easement process, through this project where an easement is taken out and you do the full line, that is a better option to us today than to grant money out. And back to my other point too, lead service lines are weird in that we do have a lot of forgivable loans tied to lead service lines. So in some cases, a community would not actually have to take out more debt to do this project. It would just be a grant to the, forgivable loan to the community to do that work. Other cases, it does need to be a loan. And that's just kind of the name of the game because it revolves back to us. And that's kind of like I said, that's how we continue to be a viable program moving forward. So Michael, I'm happy to talk to you offline about how other communities in Indiana are doing it. But it's a good question. And a lot of utilities are grappling with this right now of, okay, I have to replace these lead service lines. How am I going to do that? And this is kind of our current approach to that.
Thanks. So the next question is again about projects. So if a city is installing a UV treatment for surcharges during severe storms, could some of this funding be used for installation of that treatment?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. Like I said, I just started the clean water side, which includes stormwater a few months ago, so I'm still learning. But yes, I believe any installation of UV treatment during sewer storms would be eligible. More than you think would be eligible under these rules. If you have any questions about eligibility, you can email me as well, but I'm going to say yes to this. And again, if you want to email me offline, I can give you a more detailed answer on the UV treatment for storm sewers.
Next was about septic. So you mentioned elimination of septic, but is replacement of septic with a better system eligible, or are repairs to septic systems eligible?
Yeah, you guys know the questions to ask. So we only do septic elimination. That's the answer. We rarely are doing, some states do have septic repairs. I'm trying to think of a state that does that. Colorado does that. A lot of Western states where the most technically viable option is just to have a septic system, they do fund some of those things. In Indiana, we're a pretty, it's not hard to, it is in some places, but it's not extremely hard to run sewer in most places. And so we have not done any on-site, replacement of systems. To that point as well, I'll reemphasize that our borrowers need to be, municipalities, utilities, not-for-profit water corporations, basically a corporation that does the water treatment is the people that we're going to loan to. I do get a lot of emails asking if I do individual loans to septic owners individually. I can't do that. It has to be these larger entities, which is why we don't typically do on-site systems replacement of those.
Great. I encourage folks to send questions in the chat, but until we get some more questions, I have some myself. So speaking more to the application process and the scorecard you were bringing up, and then also you've mentioned, forgivable loans. Could you speak more to when your agency would be using a forgivable loan, and at what point in the process does that come up?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like I said, July 1st is when we have our final rank and scoring sheets completed. And we have all the projects in for the state fiscal year. Then we have that fundable range. We only do forgivable loans for those in the fundable range. And so after July 1st, when we see where our fundable range is, we start talking to communities about what their project, what's their project's timeline. Will they close in the state fiscal year? Will they need forgivable loan? What is their rate impact? So that's when we start doing some initial investigation into the project. We'll see forgivable loan, especially around lead service line replacement, especially around disadvantaged communities. That's where it really comes up. But to say how we implement that, it really depends on the year, unfortunately. But the best thing that you can do is give us as much information as possible, and then have a financial advisor that we'll talk to make sure that we're making a financing that won't impact your community in a negative way too much. I'm trying to think of a good example here. So, if a project comes into us and if the entire project was a loan, their rates were going to go up to $150. That's when we would start talking about forgivable loans and start kind of getting it down to our sweet range, which is like between $50 and $70 on the sewer side. So it's really hard to say. It depends on the year. It depends on a lot of factors, but typically it's around those things. Was there a second part to your question?
No.
Okay. I'll also mention too that we use the term forgivable loans because grants, anytime you're dealing with federal grants, there's a lot of paperwork that comes with that, and paperwork that we don't want to do and that we don't want you to do. So we write it into a forgivable loan. It's much easier for everybody involved.
So you mentioned pairing funding. In your scorecard, are matches or paired funding considered, or are communities not required to have that upfront?
Yeah, so communities are not required to have a match per se. We'll need to, they might have to increase their rates so that we know they can pay us back. But for a matching, we do reward matching. So let's say Okra has already awarded you some points. You get points in our scoring system if you have that money in hand or that committed funding. That's the same for any local funding. Any ARPA funding has been big recently, obviously. Any RD funding. If you're applying to those programs, so let's say you're applying to Okra right now, you'll get 1 point for applying since you don't have it in hand yet. But because you're looking for a match, you'll be able to receive some points. We do like to reward some paired funding, but it by no means is a requirement. We recognize that a lot of programs do that, and we kind of want to be an option where that doesn't always have to happen.
Great. And then are communities able to submit multiple projects in 1 year? And a related question, would an individual project be able to pull from, individual, pots of money?
Yeah, that's so yes to the first one. Communities can submit for example, I had a community this past state fiscal year that submitted 2 projects at once, knowing that the one was going to be moving forward this year and the other one the next year. So for whatever reason, communities just want to get their projects on our list and on our radar. Totally fine. Typically, we would see that in one PER, one report would come to us, and it would just note that there's a phasing to it. So this is phase 1, this is phase 2. Phase 1 is for this year, phase 2 is for next year, that sort of thing. And then yes, projects are able to be drawn from different pots of money. So let's say a project comes in drinking water, and they are doing some treatment improvements as well as lead service lines. We will work, it's all one loan closing, and we note within that loan closing which pools of money it will be pulling from. So one loan, one closing, multiple funding sources will come down. Yeah.
Great. Well, it's 1:50, and I want to make sure we have time to get to the funding hubs presentation. So Bill, I'll hand it back to you. And then Brett will have more questions probably coming in the chat. And if we don't have time after Bill's portion, we can make sure to connect folks asking these questions with you and get them answered. So Bill, can you wrap us up?
Thank you. If you hear weed eaters in the background, it's weed eater day around here. So pardon the noise confusion. So the Indiana Resilience Funding Hub is brand new. And the whole reason for our existence is to augment the capacity of rural communities to successfully apply for federal resilience funding for local projects. And we're also willing to help access funding through the state, as you've heard from this webinar. We do want to strengthen the community collaborations. We know there are already organizations assisting with communities. We want to work with them. We want to engage our IU faculty and students to provide the technical support and professional development for those students. We want to provide tools, data, resources, training, and guides to help you make a stronger case for your grant funding. Next slide, please. So over the last 5 years, we've developed an extensive network throughout the state of Indiana with communities and corporations and nonprofits. We can help tap into that network if you need to collaborate with others. We offer technical expertise through our faculty and our staff. And we have, as part of the hub, 4 McKinney Climate Fellows working with us, started this week. And we also have a grant writer, a professional grant writer to assist with your grant writing. And then we also have a number of resources that you can take advantage of. And we do things like summarize grant opportunities that are coming up. Next slide, please. Our webpage, if you click on the QR code there or go to the link, you will find that we have a contact form that you can reach out to us, get on our radar. We will contact you, set up a meeting, see what your needs are, see what we can help you with. We have fact sheets that boil down these large, complicated programs into 1 or 2 pages. We have access to hubs and portals that you'll find very helpful. And we offer guides. There are guides that have been developed by national organizations, the mayor's organizations, county organizations. There are many wonderful guides out there to these funding opportunities. And then we have data tools that you can access to do things like explore whether you have a disadvantaged community or if you qualify under other types of programs. Next slide, please. There are some approaching dates and deadlines. Again, this is something we do in all of our webinars. And today was a deadline for the Urban and Community Forestry Grant. We assisted a few people with that program. The charging and fueling infrastructure has been extended to June 13th. Let us know if you need help with that. July 10th, Safe Streets for All is due, the planning and implementation piece. July 1st through August 1st, where you look at next level trails, grant round 4. And July 31st is the energy efficiency community program formula grant pre-award information sheet. And we know a number of communities that are seeking that grant and working with them. And then August 18th, the Protect Transportation Resilience Grant Program deadline. So again, these are some things to have on your radar. And again, if you need help with any of these, let us know. Thank you all for attending this webinar. If we don't have time to take your question today, we certainly will welcome your email or click on the QR code and reach out to us through the contact form on our website. We'd be happy to help you in any way we can. And Jacob, if there are any burning questions, we've had a few minutes left.
Yeah, I think Brett's answering some of them in the chat, but maybe one that would be helpful for everyone to hear is there a cap on the funding request, Brett? And can you speak about that?
Yeah, so funding caps are interesting. I have a project that came in for $95 million this year, which is fun. And I have projects that came in for 1.5 million. So we see a vast range of project costs. The short answer is, I think, what did I just type here? The short answer, I think, is yes, there is a limit. The longer answer might be, it depends. So on the drinking water side, if your project is $15 million, we fund up to $10 million with our very best interest rate. So the first $10 million of that loan, it's going to be loan money at the low at our great long-term low interest loan rate. At the additional 5 million is going to be at one of those pooled closing rates. So it's kind of a piecemeal. One, up to $10 million is going to be a great interest rate long-term. The next part will be a little bit different, a little bit higher interest rate. That's essentially our way of making sure there's enough money for everybody. If you can think about it a different way, everybody in the fundable range will get $10 million at our best rate. On the clean water side, the limit is, I think the limit is $15 million, but don't quote me on that. That also changes year to year. It's continually going up. But again, same thing on that end, where the first $15 million would be at our best rate. Anything above that will be at a different rate. I haven't seen, big cities like Evansville, Indianapolis will come in with everything all at once because they know they need to do it and they can't do it $10 million at a time. Other communities do. They come in with 5 million here, 7 million there, just to make it as beneficial to them as possible. So that's a good question.
Great. Well, I think we'll end there. Brett, you've been very helpful giving us an overview of all these programs and the increased funding this year and some great questions from everyone on the call. So there's also been questions about, are we going to be posting the PowerPoint? Yes, we'll post it. We'll also post the recording and encourage everyone to reach out to Brett if you have additional questions. So thanks so much, Brett, and hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us.